Hello, and welcome to this Fox Nation special, Daniel Penny Verdict Live. I'm Paul Morrow. So it's a case that drew national attention. Daniel Penny, a 26-year-old Marine veteran charged in the death of 30-year-old homeless man Jordan Neely on a New York City subway back in May of 2023. Now, the jury has rendered its verdict. Hung on the top charge of manslaughter 2 and not guilty, the lower charge of criminally negligent homicide. What does it all mean for New York City and for America's cities in general? Joining me now to break all of this down, great legal talent, Brian Claypool, trial attorney. So, I want to go to you first. Brian, can you break down what happened in court on Friday on how the top charge, second-degree manslaughter, was dismissed? For many of us and for many of our viewers, I'm sure it was procedurally very arcane.
Yeah, hey, Paul, great to be with you. Yeah, a lot happened on Friday. The jury hung on the most serious charge, the second-degree manslaughter. But I happened to be on Laura Ingraham's show on Friday, and I talked about what I thought the judge did that was in error. He failed to go back to the jury and find out why they hung. And what I mean by that is justification was the top defense for Daniel Penny. That means really self-defense, that he acted in self-defense, right? And if this jury hung on self-defense or justification, then this entire case should have been tossed out on Friday. So the judge never went back and cleared that up. And then I learned, actually, I talked to one of Daniel Penny's lawyers last night on the phone. And I learned, Paul, that the way this charge, the more serious charge actually was dropped was not the hung jury. It was an oral motion by the prosecutor. She got up and did an oral motion and said, I move to now dismiss this charge with prejudice. And what she was doing was trying to curry favor with the jury and try to make it look now like the prosecution is doing the right thing. And we're going to now dismiss this charge and let's make a deal and try door number 2 now and get a consolation prize with this lesser charge. And I just find this very inappropriate, inexcusable. It shouldn't have happened. This case should have been thrown out on Friday. And albeit this was a not guilty verdict for Daniel Penny, what he went through in this trial, it sends a terrible message to everybody across this country about whether they have a thought about intervening to help somebody when they are in harm's way.
Yeah, that may very well be one of the repercussions of this. Brian, let's go to you now. Everybody's wondering one major question. Maybe you can tease it out for us. Can Daniel Penny be retried on this top charge the jury hung on Friday?
Paul, absolutely not. And it's for the reason I gave you. I spoke to one of his lawyers last night. Strategically, what they decided to do was not to go in this morning and have the entire case thrown out. The reason why they did not want to do that is because they got the prosecutor on an oral motion to dismiss that the second-degree manslaughter with prejudice. So Penny's lawyers got on record with prejudice. The judge then granted the oral motion by the prosecutors. What does that mean for your viewers? That means that case can never be tried again. So Penny's lawyers were happy as of last night that the more serious charge was gone. It's gone forever. He can't be prosecuted on that charge. He can't be prosecuted on this charge. And to Jonna's point and David's point and all of us, they were a little pessimistic as well going in this morning. They thought they had a slight chance of pulling out an acquittal, but they were realistic. But one other point I want to make, Paul, is here's another potential basis for this inconsistent verdict, right? When I was talking about justification, that, in my opinion, should have been the number one question on this verdict form. You know, was Daniel Penny legally justified in detaining Jordan Neely, as he did, right? Yes or no? And that should have been the global question. If it's yes, then the case is thrown out. If it's no, then you go down and you analyze the 2 charges. But when I talked to Penny's lawyers last night, the way the judge handled this was he had justification integrated into each charge. So technically the jury had to decide twice justification, right? So they may have hung on justification on the higher charge and for whatever reason got in there this morning and said, hey, wait a minute, on the lesser charge, he was justified. He did act in self-defense, and that's why we're acquitting him on the lesser charge.
Brian, back to you. Now, what do you think the results of this, and I'm just asking you to put on your prognosticator hat here. It's not purely legal, but what do you think the effects of this are going to be on the atmosphere in the city, and more specifically, let me really drill right down to it, on the prosecutors? It's not just Alvin Bragg. New York City has 5 state prosecutors, and really many of them, all right, I don't know if I want to say all, but the majority of them were very on board with all the bail reform and all the reforms that we've seen here in the city that have really been detrimental to civil life here. Do you think this is a message? Do you think the prosecutors are hearing this? What do you think?
Hey, Paul, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the result, and although we all had thought that this case shouldn't be brought and that Penny should be acquitted, let's face it, Paul, this jury took place in a super liberal jurisdiction, right? And the result is right. It was messy getting there, but this result sends a message, and it's consistent with, I think, the political tone of our country right now, with President Trump winning big, and there's been a shift now. There's a shift now, right, more in favor of the police, right? In favor of law enforcement. Even out here in Los Angeles, where I'm seated here in Los Angeles, we had a very liberal district attorney, Paul, named George Gascon, who he got crushed in a recent election by a Republican in a Democratic county, LA County. That illuminates what's happening in this country, and it's happening in New York City right now. This is very refreshing to see this result, and in LA, it's happening in a state known for being democratic and liberal. And what it's doing is it's sending a message to prosecutors too, that you're going to be penalized for overcharging, and you're going to have to explain yourself to taxpayers, to the community, why you're overcharging, and then trying to use that to dupe a jury into finding somebody guilty. And what I mean by that, Paul, is that in my opinion, I think under the law that this case should have been tossed, because when you lose on the higher charge, you can't then say, oh, well, let's go bargain for the lesser charge. So the result is what we needed. How we got there was not what we needed. But I think in the end, prosecutors are going to be much more reluctant to bring charges like this, especially when people are intervening on behalf of others. Paul, I've had cases out here in LA where I've sued school districts where teenage girls are in the bathroom getting beaten up by others, and resource officers who are hired to protect the girls are in there with a camera taking a picture of that. That's the mentality that we have been living in. Finally, we get a guy like Daniel Penny steps up, does the right thing. We finally get a good result. And I'm hoping and praying that that does send a message to people across the country too, that you should step in. You should help somebody who is in harm's way.
So Brian, my question to you is the following. What do you think about the fact that the judge allowed some of these protesters to not only scream and yell outside the courtroom, but in fact allow some of them in, and some of them were sitting very close to where Daniel Penny was? There was some reporting that there were some attempts at intimidation. Do you think the judge could fully control this courtroom?
Paul, great question. Absolutely not. Outside the courthouse, inside the courthouse, and let's go one step further. I know Penny's lawyers had brought this up. They moved for a mistrial. Why? Because the prosecutor was eliciting comments about racial overtures, right? She made a comment about, you can't devalue this young man's life. Who's talking about that? Who's talking about Daniel Penny dehumanizing or devaluing Jordan Neely's life? Do you really think Daniel Penny sitting on that subway with all these people fearing for their lives in that subway was going through the analysis? He's African American, I'm going after that guy. That has nothing to do with this. Zero. He wasn't doing that analysis. He was doing the analysis actually of what law enforcement would do. We were lucky to have Daniel Penny on that subway. And one other point I want to make which was really irresponsible by this prosecutor. She made, I think, in closing, she says to the jury, Daniel Penny should have never assumed that Jordan Neely had something in his pocket. Did you hear that? Yeah. That's absolutely false. That's not the standard. And we can't go into a situation with a guy with a coat who's saying, I'm ready to die. You can't stand there and wait and see if somebody's going to pull out a knife or a gun, because it'll be way too late. You can't Monday morning quarterback these situations. I've had a lot of civil rights cases with police officers involved. The standard is a reasonably objective standard. If you have a reasonable basis to presume there's some fear of imminent harm, you can act and use that force. And that's what we have to remember from this case. This was a victory for that standard of care.
You know, it occurred to me during the trial that the defense might have benefited by bringing the jury to a subway car and position everybody where they were, according to the witnesses, just to lend an atmosphere. I know they all take the subway. According to the reporting, all the jurors take the subway sometimes, but, you know, there's nothing like being there and feeling that claustrophobia. Guys, we got to wrap it up there. Great conversation. Thank you so much for the legal insights. This was terrific. Once again, to all of you out there with Fox Nation, I am Paul Mauro. We thank you very much for watching today.